One Saturday night, I was home alone because my parents went to the market. They left around 9 p.m., telling me they would be back in a few hours. I decided to take advantage of my alone time and ordered a pizza. I called my favorite pizza place and placed an order for a large pepperoni pizza. They told me it would be delivered in 30 minutes. While waiting, I watched TV and played some video games. Everything was going fine until I heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen. It sounded like a faint scratching or tapping. At first I thought it was just the house settling, but the noise continued. I muted the TV and listened carefully. The sound was definitely coming from the kitchen. I walked slowly to the kitchen, feeling a bit uneasy. When I reached the doorway, the noise stopped. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. I shrugged it off and went back to the living room. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. It must be the pizza delivery, I thought, feeling relieved. I opened the door and saw a man standing there, holding a pizza box. He was wearing a cap and the uniform of the pizza place, but something about him felt off. His smile was a little too wide, and his eyes didn't seem friendly. "One large pepperoni pizza," he said, holding out the box. I paid him quickly and took the pizza, closing the door behind me. As I walked back to the living room, I heard a loud thud from upstairs. My heart skipped a beat. I knew I was home alone, so what could that noise be? Trying to stay calm, I set the pizza down on the coffee table and listened. The house was silent again. I decided to check upstairs, even though I was scared. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and slowly walked up the stairs. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding. When I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed that my bedroom door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it earlier. I pushed the door open with the bat and peeked inside. The room was empty, but something felt wrong. I looked around and saw that my window was open. I never left my window open. I walked over and shut the window, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone been in the house? As I turned to leave the room, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I hurried out of the room and rushed back downstairs. I sat on the couch, trying to calm down. I took a deep breath and opened the pizza box, hoping some food would help me relax. But when I looked inside, I froze. Instead of pizza, the box was filled with old, dusty dolls. Their eyes stared up at me, and some were missing limbs. My stomach churned with fear. I slammed the box shut and backed away. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. It was a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Did you enjoy your special delivery?" Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone and called my parents, but they didn't answer. I didn't know what to do. Then, I heard the scratching noise again, this time from the living room window. I turned slowly, my blood running cold. Outside the window, I saw the delivery man standing in the yard, grinning widely. He lifted a hand and waved slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The front door creaked open, and I heard footsteps coming toward me. At that moment, my parents' car pulled into the driveway. The man's smile disappeared, and he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. My parents rushed inside, seeing the fear on my face. I tried to explain what happened, but it sounded too crazy to believe. We called the police, but they didn't find anyone. The only evidence was the pizza box filled with dolls. To this day, I can't explain what happened, but I'll never forget the terror I felt that night. Being home alone has never felt the same since. On a chilly autumn night, I was walking home after visiting a friend's house. It was almost midnight, and the streets were deserted. I lived on Elm Street, a quiet neighborhood with old houses and big trees that cast eerie shadows under the moonlight. As I turned onto Elm Street, I noticed an old woman standing at the corner, leaning on a cane. She wore a tattered shawl and a dress that looked like it was from another era. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, staring straight at me. I felt a shiver run down my spine but tried to ignore her and kept walking. When I was a few feet away from her, she suddenly spoke. "Beware the shadows, child. They come alive at midnight." Her voice was a chilling whisper that echoed in the silent street. I nodded politely, trying to hide my fear, and walked past her. But as I did, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and repeated, "Beware the shadows." I pulled away and hurried down the street, my heart pounding. The closer I got to my house, the more I felt like I was being watched. The shadows cast by the trees seemed to move and shift unnaturally. I glanced back and saw the old woman still standing at the corner watching me. I quickened my pace, desperate to get home. As I reached my front porch, I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I finally managed to unlock the door and rushed inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard a soft whispering sound. I turned around and saw shadows creeping along the walls, moving toward me. I remembered the old woman's warning and felt a wave of terror wash over me. I backed away, but the shadows followed, growing darker and more menacing. They seemed to have a life of their own, writhing and twisting as they closed in on me. In a panic, I ran to the living room and turned on every light, hoping to banish the shadows. For a moment, the room was bright, and the shadows receded. But then, the lights flickered again and went out, plunging the room into darkness. The whispering grew louder, and I felt a cold breath on my neck. I screamed and ran to my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I hid under the covers, shaking with fear as the whispering and shadows seemed to fill the house. I stayed awake all night, too terrified to sleep. When morning finally came, the shadows were gone and the house was silent, but I never forgot the old woman's warning. To this day, I avoid walking alone at night and always keep my lights on, fearing the return of the shadows on Elm Street.
My most common run is Vancouver to San Francisco. It's an easy trip most of the time with very little challenge involved. I tend to prefer driving into the night because there's less traffic. Of course, driving around in the middle of nowhere during witching hour means I've seen my share of things. UFOs, Bigfoot, the Worksman, but none of that stuff has ever scared me nearly as bad as the people you see walking along the shoulder of the road far from civilization. I noticed my first one on my junior run down south on the number 5. It was a lady in a blue summer dress, just strolling down the side of the highway underneath the full moon, not a care in the world. Now we were on a stretch that was miles and miles away from anything in either direction, and I was the first vehicle on the road that she'd likely seen since dusk. She didn't even look up to acknowledge me, though. Instead, she just kept on walking with a sort of vacant smile. I chalked it up to some hippie from the Oregon Trail hopped up on something from a nearby campsite and kept driving. But she was only the first. It's not every trip you spot them, but sometimes you see a few on a single go. It always struck me as strange because you never seem to see them during the day. Or maybe you do, but they don't stick out as much under the sun. Even so, once you know they're there, you'll start noticing the hell out of them whenever you're driving far from civilization in the dark. The other truckers call them moon wanders, but I prefer shoulder walkers, since that's always where they are. Almost like trains on a track, they walk that little white line to wherever they're going. They're different shapes and sizes too. Men, women. Tall, fat, ugly, pretty, just folks like you'd see anywhere. Sure, they're creepy, but for a long time I didn't pay them any mind beyond noticing them on occasion in the split second that they were visible as I cruised past. But one night a few months ago I passed by what looked like an old lady. She was in a hospital gown and looked just like someone on death row. Sunken, given up on life sort of eyes, frizzy white hair and pale skin. She was smiling just like her grandkids had called her name. Her pace was a slow shuffle along the shoulder, and just looking at her I could imagine the sound of her hospital slippers running just over top the gravelly road. I wanted to keep driving because, well, to be honest, she gave me the willies. But hell, she reminded me of my own sweet grandma. God rest her soul. So I brought my rig to a slow stop and, collecting up the flashlight I keep in my glove box, stepped out of the cab. I could hear her coming before I could see her as I'd driven a few meters ahead of her due to the long stop time. I could visualize her wrinkly feet in those hospital slippers, shuffling ever onward. Quickly, I checked the Maps app on my phone and saw that the closest town to where we were was over 50 miles. No way this old lady was walking that. Putting my phone in my jeans, I held up my flashlight and started walking towards the sound of her footfalls. Hello? Mom? I called out, hoping that she would speak up. No such luck, just more scraping. My hairs were on edge now as I waited for her to enter into the dim light of my flashlight. I nearly cried out as the ghostly appearance came into view. Not because anything was different from before, just because she looked so much more sickly up close. Mom, are you okay? You're in the middle of nowhere, you know? She didn't say nothing, just kept smiling and moving steadily forward. Now my heart was beating hard. She's just senile and she needs my help, I thought out loud. But my feet were frozen in place. They were going back to the truck or they weren't moving at all. She was getting closer though, and as she reached within 10 feet or so, her wrinkled hands began to reach slowly up. Her fingers wiggled in my direction like a grandma reaching for her grandchild's face. She opened her mouth but didn't say anything, just grinned at me with pale gums. My legs gave out, and as I fell onto my side, she reached down for me with surprising speed and dexterity. Before I knew what was going on, she had her bony fingers around my ankles and I was getting dragged down the road. Desperately, I pulled back, but her grip was superhuman, and the addition of my weight didn't seem to slow her walk in the least. She stared down at me with those beady, sunken eyes, mouth agape in a smile. I kicked at her with all the fight I had in me, and luckily connected with her jaw. To my horror, it was like kicking solid concrete, but luckily she let go despite having no visible injury. I crawled backwards towards the middle of the road and she kept walking down the shoulder. Her hands fell back down to her side and her mouth closed into a tight-lipped smile. But her gaze stayed locked on mine as she slowly shuffled out of my flashlight's beam. I waited as the scraping bit by bit faded from my ears, and after what ended up being a half hour of stunned silence, I worked up the nerve to get up and go back to my rig. No sign of the lady, but when I climbed into my cab and sped down the highway, it didn't take long to catch up with her. Her eyes were still stuck on me. They probably had been the whole time as she walked away. The last I saw of her as I gunned it away was her thin, chapped, smirking lips. According to some other guys I know, I'm the first to try and interact with a shoulder walker, and if God is good, I'll be the last. Since then, I've seen plenty more. Strolling down the highway in the pitch dark. I even saw a kid once. But there ain't no way I'm ever stopping again for them. And if you're smart, you won't neither. Since that night, the shoulder walkers are always looking right at me when I drive past, which they never used to do. Almost like since that old lady saw me, they all did. I'd hate to think what would have happened if I'd not managed to get free, but I can rest easy knowing I've put my warning out there in public. Maybe I'll save a few folks with this story. Before we get into the next story, if you come for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to a channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share the stories with your friends and family. Thanks. I was a new nurse at our hospital and only been working there a couple of months. I had brought a patient of mine up to day surgery from the ER for an endoscopy, and they called back down and asked me to bring her family up because she only spoke Italian and not enough English, and they needed someone to consent for the procedure. After dropping them off, I walked past the waiting room to head back down the hall to the elevators. I took the back way to get to the ER, and the hallways are all deserted. It used to be the pediatric wing of the hospital, but that is all shut down for years, and the rooms are just empty and full of broken equipment and beds and crap. As I reached the old nurses' station at the T-junction between the pediatric hallway and the hallway that goes to the elevators, I saw a little girl standing across from the nurses' station further down the hall. She had big pigtails, was wearing a brown dress, white shoes, holding a teddy bear. I thought perhaps she was a family member who had walked away from the day surgery waiting room. I was concerned that she would go into one of the rooms and get hurt or lost. So I said, "Hey little girl, what are you doing? You don't need to be over there, you're going to get hurt." And I walked around the nursing station to go grab her hand and bring her back. I shit you not, she vanished as I got about 15 feet away from her. Every hair on my body stood up straight and I turned and ran like a bat out of hell down to the elevator. I pounded that button for what seemed like an eternity until the elevator got to the floor. As I got back to the ER, I walked up to the nurse's desk, white as a sheet. And one of the older nurses looked at me and said, "Jesus Christ, what's wrong with you?" I remember babbling like an idiot as I tried to tell them what happened. After listening to me for a moment or two, the nurse said, "Oh, you saw the little girl ghost. She's been around here for years." And I remember saying, "Well, thanks for telling me about it before this." Apparently the ghost has even been seen down in the ER, ducking in and out of patient rooms and peeking around curtains. My wife worked up on the T8 floor and she said that one time on night a whole row of patient rooms started yelling about a little girl that was running around in the rooms. I guess she gets around. I work at a small convenience store located in an old, creaky building. This building has been standing for over 100 years and has seen many changes. It has a history, and sometimes that history feels very present. My night shift usually goes smoothly, but recently my workers have been complaining about strange occurrences. They hear horrible voices, see things move on their own, and occasionally catch sight of a shadow passing by. It was a quiet Thursday night when things took a turn for the worse. I arrived at the store around 10 p.m., ready for my shift. The rain was pouring heavily outside, making the old building seem even more eerie. My two co-workers, Mark and Lisa, were visibly shaken. They had been working the evening shift and looked like they couldn't wait to leave. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked, noticing their pale faces. Mark glanced at Lisa before answering. "We've been hearing those voices again. And something knocked over a whole shelf of canned goods by itself." Lisa nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "And there's this shadow. It keeps passing by in the back room. We both saw it." I tried to reassure them. "I'll check it out. You two go home and get some rest." As they hurried out, I felt a chill run down my spine. I was now alone in the old spooky building. The hum of the refrigerators and the distant sound of thunder added to the unsettling atmosphere. I decided to start my night by checking the back room where the shadow was reportedly seen. I grabbed a flashlight and walked towards the back, the wooden floor creaking under my feet. The back room was dimly lit, and the light flickered as if struggling to stay on. I looked around, shining my flashlight into every corner, but saw nothing unusual. "Hello?" I called out, hoping to hear nothing in return. For a moment there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to leave, I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice. My heart started to race. I turned around quickly, my flashlight beam dancing across the walls. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure darting across the room and disappearing into the darkness. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Gathering my courage, I followed the direction the shadow had gone, but there was nothing there. The room felt colder, and I could sense an eerie presence around me. Deciding I needed to calm down, I returned to the front of the store. As I walked back, I noticed that some items on the shelves had moved. A can of soup was rolling on its own, and a packet of chips fell to the floor. I picked them up, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. "It's just the old building," I told myself, though I didn't really believe it. I sat behind the counter, keeping an eye on the security monitors. For a while, everything was quiet. Then, out of nowhere, the bell above the door rang. I looked up, but no one was there. The door was closed. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't normal. I checked the security footage. The cameras were old and the images grainy, but I could see something that made my blood run cold. A dark figure, almost like a shadow, was moving around the back room, the same one I had just investigated. It didn't look human. Its movements were erratic, and it seemed to float rather than walk. I decided to call the police. "There's someone, or something, in the store," I explained, my voice trembling. They said they would send someone over, but it might take a while due to the storm. As I waited, the situation got worse. Lights began to flicker all over the store. Products flew off the shelves as if an invisible force was throwing them. The whispering voices grew louder, almost chanting my name. I felt a cold hand brush against my arm, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I was about to lose it when the doorbell rang again. This time, it was the police. They looked around but found no one. They suggested it might be electrical issues or my imagination, but I knew better. The building was haunted. After that night, I made a decision. I hired extra staff so no one would have to work alone, especially at night. We kept the lights bright and the doors locked. The strange occurrences continued but were less frequent. The old building still held its secrets, but at least we weren't facing them alone. To this day, I wonder about the history of that place and what kind of spirits might be trapped there. I can still hear the whispers and see the shadowy figure in my mind. The quiet nights at the convenience store are never quite as peaceful as they once were.
It was a foggy night when I decided to take a walk to clear my mind. Midnight had just struck, and the thick fog made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I walked down Pine Street, where the old creaky houses stood silently, shrouded in mist. As I walked, I heard footsteps behind me, faint but distinct. I stopped and turned around, but all I could see was the dense fog. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just my imagination, and continued walking. But the footsteps resumed, closer this time. My heart began to race. I quickened my pace, hoping to lose whoever was following me. The footsteps matched my speed, growing louder and more insistent. I turned onto Birch Lane, a narrow, poorly lit street, hoping to lose my pursuer in the maze of houses. Suddenly, a tall, dark figure emerged from the fog in front of me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its eyes boring. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure remained silent, and a chill ran down my spine. I slowly backed away, but the figure took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between us. Panicking, I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the foggy night. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps heavy and relentless. I darted into an alley, hoping to find a place to hide. The alley was dark and narrow, with trash bins and old crates scattered about. I crouched behind a large bin, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. The footsteps grew louder, and I held my breath, praying the figure wouldn't find me. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, I heard a low, raspy voice whisper, "I see you." My blood turned to ice, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed and bolted out of the alley, not daring to look back. I ran all the way home, my lungs burning and my legs aching. When I finally reached my front door, I burst inside and slammed it shut, locking it behind me. I collapsed on the floor, shaking with fear. The fog outside seemed to press against the windows, and I felt as if the figure was still out there, watching me. I stayed up all night, too afraid to sleep, jumping at every sound. The next morning, the fog had lifted, and everything seemed normal. But I knew I would never forget the terror I felt that night. To this day, I avoid walking in the fog, always fearing the return of the figure in the mist on Pine Street. One night, I was walking home from my friend's house on Maple Street. It was close to midnight, and the street was eerily quiet. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I had always felt safe in our neighborhood, but that night, something felt different. The street lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the pavement. As I walked, I noticed a shadow moving quickly behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I shook my head, thinking it was just my imagination. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Suddenly, I heard a low whisper behind me. My heart raced as I spun around again, but the street was empty. Feeling more uneasy by the minute, I quickened my pace. I was only a few blocks from home. I just needed to get there and lock the door. As I reached the corner of Maple and Oak, I saw a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a hat that obscured his face. His presence sent a chill down my spine. I tried to ignore him and kept walking, but as I passed, he spoke in a deep, raspy voice. "Lost, are we?" I didn't reply and kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't follow, but I could feel his eyes on me. I turned the corner and broke into a run. When I finally reached my house, I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder to see if the man was following me. Thankfully, he wasn't there. I rushed inside, locked the door, and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. I thought I was safe, but then the phone rang. I answered, my voice shaking. "Hello?" The same raspy voice from the street replied, "You can't hide from me." I dropped the phone and backed away, staring at the door. The shadows outside the window seemed to move, and I realized that I might never truly be safe from whatever was lurking on Maple Street that night.
In the late 90s or early 2000s, my brother, a truck driver, had a strange and scary experience while driving through Pennsylvania. He was on his way back to New Jersey, hauling a load that needed to be delivered the next morning. After hours on the road, he decided to pull over and rest. He parked his truck behind two other trailers on a quiet, dark stretch of road. The night was calm, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. He climbed into the sleeping compartment of his truck, trying to get some much-needed sleep. The other trucks seemed to be doing the same, their drivers already settled in for the night. Around 3 a.m., my brother was suddenly awakened by a loud bang on the right door of his truck. His heart raced as he quickly grabbed the baseball bat he always kept nearby for protection. He peeked out the window but saw nothing but darkness. The road was empty, and the other trucks were still and silent. Just as he was about to lie back down, he heard another bang, this time on the left door. He jumped up, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Holding the bat tightly, he peered out the left window. Again, there was nothing there, only the quiet night staring back at him. Suddenly, a series of bangs hit both doors at the same time, louder and heavier than before. The truck began to shake violently as if someone was trying to break in. He looked through the curtains on both sides, desperate to catch a glimpse of whoever or whatever was causing this chaos. But there was no one there. The banging continued, relentless and terrifying. My brother's mind raced. He couldn't explain what was happening. There was no sign of anyone outside. The eerie, empty road seemed to mock his fear. In a panic, he scrambled into the driver's seat and started the engine. As his truck roared to life, he noticed the two trucks in front of him doing the same. Their headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the empty road ahead. It was as if the other drivers had experienced the same terrifying events and were just as eager to get out of there. With his heart pounding, he followed the other trucks, speeding down the lonely road. They drove for miles without stopping, the fear still fresh in their minds. Finally, they reached a well-lit rest area, and the three trucks pulled over. My brother got out of his truck, his legs shaking, and approached the other drivers. They all looked pale and shaken. One of them, an older man with a grizzled beard, spoke first. "Did you hear it too?" he asked, his voice trembling. My brother nodded, still clutching his bat. "Yeah, the banging. It was like someone was trying to get in." The third driver, a younger man, looked around nervously. "I checked outside. There was no one there. What the hell was that?" They stood there in silence for a few moments, each trying to make sense of what had happened. None of them had any answers. They decided to stick together for the rest of the night, parking their trucks close to each other in the well-lit rest area. The next morning, as the sun rose and the fear began to fade, they parted ways. My brother continued his journey to New Jersey, but the memory of that night stayed with him. He never could explain what happened, and he never experienced anything like it again. To this day, he still gets chills when he talks about that night, the banging on the doors, the shaking truck, and the eerie emptiness outside. It was a night that left him questioning what he had encountered on that dark Pennsylvania road. Was it a ghost, a prank, or something else entirely? He may never know, but the fear he felt was all too real. I was camping with my husband and his family at a small remote lake in New Mexico. There were about 10 people in our group and another group of 6 people in the next campsite. It was nighttime, and both groups were doing typical activities, making s'mores, having a few drinks and telling stories, when we all heard what sounded like a little girl yelling out for help. Neither group had children with them, but we were all positive we were hearing a little girl and decided to search the area we heard the noises from together. There was a field behind our campsites, and we all saw a very tall, pure white figure standing maybe 100 feet away from us in the field, making the noises. We all agreed this thing looked maybe 6 feet tall, skinny and white as can be. We made our way closer to investigate, but whatever it was that we saw started backing off as we got closer, and it disappeared into the trees. All night we continued to hear a little girl calling for help as we tried to sleep.
One of the scariest experiences of my life happened when I was a teenager, home alone for the first time. My parents had taken my younger brother to an event, leaving me by myself on a quiet Sunday. I was enjoying the freedom. Everything was going great, until I decided to visit a friend, even though my parents specifically told me not to leave the house. In my excitement, I forgot to lock the door when I left. When I returned home hours later, I had a terrible gut feeling. The house felt strange, almost as if it was holding its breath. I noticed that the kitchen cabinets were open and things were scattered around. A creeping unease began to settle in. I couldn't believe someone was actually there because it was so quiet. I shouted through the house, but there was no answer. The silence was unnerving. I began to feel a bit better, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid until my phone rang. The caller ID phone. Curious and looking for a distraction, I answered the call. All I heard was deep, heavy breathing. Fear gripped me. It felt like something out of a horror movie. I kept asking, "Who is this?" But the caller hung up. My heart was racing. 2 minutes later again. It was the same heavy breathing, but it sounded angrier this time. Again, the caller hung up without saying a word. Frustration mixed with my fear as I received yet another call from the unknown ID. The breathing started again, slow and menacing. Then I heard a deep, quiet voice whisper, "I'm in the house." My heart stopped, and chills ran down my spine. I tried to act tough, thinking it might be a prank from my friend or brother. The caller hung up, and I forced myself to think logically. Maybe it was just a cruel joke. But then I heard creaking from upstairs, followed by loud, deliberate footsteps. I froze. Every muscle in my body tensed. My mind raced with thoughts. Should I run? Should I hide? The footsteps grew louder, coming down the stairs. Then I heard something drop, a loud thud that jolted me into action. It gave me just enough time to escape as the intruder started sprinting downstairs. Back door and ran into the woods behind our house. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone and called the cops. I explained everything, my voice trembling. They assured me they would be there soon. I stayed hidden, my eyes darting around, half expecting the intruder to appear from the shadows. When the police arrived, I cautiously came out of my hiding spot. They found the front door wide open, just as I had left it. They searched the house thoroughly, but found no one. The kitchen was a mess, with drawers pulled out and items strewn about. My parents arrived shortly after, panic evident on their faces. The police took my statement and reassured us they would patrol the area more frequently. Despite their reassurances, the intruder was never found. The experience left a deep mark on me. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside made me jump. My parents were furious that I had left the house, but their anger was mixed with relief that I was safe. They installed a new security system and reinforced the locks on all the doors and windows. I learned a hard lesson about responsibility and the importance of following instructions. To this day, I'm extra careful about locking doors and being aware of my surroundings. The memory of that night still haunts me, a reminder of how quickly things can go from normal to terrifying. It was a wild and terrifying experience, but I'm lucky to be able to share this story.
I've never lived in a haunted house, but my mother did as a teen, recounting a true event. Other houses on her street had strange things going on too. A few homes away from her lived a family. One night, the daughter went to bed with a bad headache. The next day, she was passed away from an aneurysm. After her funeral, the family went away to get their minds off the tragedy, and the father asked my uncle to check on their pets. My mom and dad went with him. My mother had heard there was a grand piano, and she wanted to play it. My dad was studying to be a veterinarian. After entering the house, my uncle and my father headed to the basement to see the animals, and my mother went to the piano on the ground floor. She was playing it when she felt something brush her ankles. She thought a cat must have left the basement and walked past her. She kept playing, and then she felt it again. She looked under the piano and saw nothing. When she started again, she felt hands clasp her legs tightly. She dashed to the basement door, called my uncle and father, and waited for them. Back outside, my uncle could tell my mom was rattled and asked what was wrong. She told him what had happened, and he turned white. He told her the daughter who had died used to play a game with her father. When he played the piano, she'd crawl underneath, grab his ankles and push his feet up and down on the pedals.
Our street is nearly 200 years old and very picturesque, so it attracts many tourists to our city. They come to take photos of the beautiful old houses and charming gardens. Often, I come upstairs from the garden-level kitchen and living room to the street-level first floor to find tourists peering through the windows if I haven't closed the curtains. It's annoying and kind of creepy, but I've gotten used to it. One night, I was getting ready to go to bed. It was late and I was tired from a long day. I walked upstairs, thinking about how much I wanted to crawl into bed and sleep. As I reached the top of the stairs, I noticed something strange. There was a man standing in front of our window. Our windows have heavy wooden interior shutters that we close at night, but I hadn't closed them yet. At first, I thought he was just another curious tourist, so I didn't think much of it. I walked over to the window to close one of the shutters, but when I turned to close the other, I saw him looking directly at me. His face was full of anger, and it stopped me in my tracks. We stared at each other for what felt like a long time. His eyes were cold, and his expression was furious. Then, suddenly, his face twisted into a big, creepy, leering smile. It was the kind of smile that made my skin crawl. He slowly walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the street. I felt a chill run down my spine. I quickly closed the shutters and locked the window. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I kept thinking about the man and his angry, twisted face. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for any strange noises. Every creak of the house made me jump. I got up at least 8 times to check the deadbolt and chain on the front door. I made sure all the windows were locked, and even checked the basement door, just to be safe. The next morning, I felt exhausted. I hadn't slept much, and the events of the previous night were still fresh in my mind. I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man. Why had he been so angry? Why did he smile at me like that? As the days passed, I tried to convince myself that it was just a random encounter with a strange tourist. Maybe he had too much to drink, or maybe he was just having a bad day. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to it. A week later, I was coming home late from work. It was a quiet night, and the street was empty. As I approached my house, I saw something that made my heart race. There, standing in front of my window, was the same man. He was looking into the house, just like before. My heart pounding in my chest. He turned and saw me. This time, his face was expressionless, which somehow felt even more unsettling. I quickly walked past him, trying to act like I didn't notice him. I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. I rushed inside and locked the door behind me. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath. I peeked through the peephole, but he was gone. I felt a wave of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept hearing noises outside, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. The next day, I decided to call the police. I told them about the man and how he had been standing outside my window. They said they would patrol the area more often, but there wasn't much they could do without more information. Since then, about closing the shutters and locking the doors. I still see tourists peeking through the windows, but none of them have ever scared me as much as that man. I hope I never see him again, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, watching.
I work at a small convenience store on the edge of town. It's a quiet place, especially at night, which is when I usually have my shift. Most people avoid working the graveyard shift, but I don't mind. I like the peace and quiet. Plus, I get to do my schoolwork and listen to music without any interruptions. One Friday night around midnight, I was alone in the store. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the occasional car passing by on the highway. I was stocking shelves, trying to keep busy, when the bell above the door rang. I looked up, expecting to see a customer, but no one was there. I shrugged it off, thinking it must have been the wind. I went back to my work, but a few minutes later I heard a noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded like someone knocking on the storage room door. My heart started to race. I was sure I had locked the door when I started my shift. I grabbed my flashlight and walked slowly to the back. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer. I reached the storage room and tried the doorknob. It was locked. I felt a little better knowing that no one could be inside. I decided to check the security cameras to see if I could spot anything unusual. I went to the office and turned on the monitor. The cameras showed the empty aisles of the store, the parking lot, and the back entrance. Everything looked normal, but then I noticed something strange. In the camera that pointed toward the storage room, I saw a dark figure standing just outside the door. It was tall and shadowy, with no distinguishable features. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the figure was still there. It seemed to be staring right at the camera. A chill ran down my spine. I decided to go back to the storage room and confront whatever was there. I didn't want to, but I needed to make sure I wasn't imagining things. As I approached felt a cold draft. The air grew heavy, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I turned the corner and saw the figure standing in front of the door. It was even taller and more menacing in person. Its eyes were just dark voids, and it felt like they were sucking the light out of the room. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure slowly raised its arm and pointed at me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Suddenly, the door to the storage room swung open, and the figure disappeared inside. I stood there, staring at the open door, trying to muster the courage to follow. Taking a deep breath, storage room. The light flickered as I entered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room was empty, but I could feel a presence. It felt like something was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I shined my flashlight around, looking for any signs of the figure. Then I heard a whispering, like someone was speaking just behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was speaking a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was menacing. I backed out of the room, my hands shaking. I locked the storage room door and ran back to the office. I checked the cameras again, but the figure was gone. The store looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, lurking in the shadows. For the rest of my shift, I stayed in the office, too scared to go back out into the store. I kept watching the cameras, but nothing else happened. When my shift finally ended, I practically ran out of the store, not looking back until I was safely in my car. The next day, I told him. He laughed and said it was probably just my imagination, but I knew what I saw. I couldn't get the image of that dark figure out of my mind. I decided to switch to the day shift after that. I didn't want to be alone in that store at night ever again. To this day, I don't know what I saw or what it wanted, but I know it was real. The graveyard shift may seem quiet and peaceful, but sometimes the silence hides something much more sinister.
One night, I was walking home from my friend's house on Maple Street. It was close to midnight, and the street was eerily quiet. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I had always felt safe in our neighborhood, but that night, something felt different. The street lights flickered, casting long, twisted shadows on the pavement. As I walked, I noticed a shadow moving quickly behind me. I turned around, but no one was there. I shook my head, thinking it was just my imagination. I kept walking, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Suddenly, I heard a low whisper behind me. My heart raced as I spun around again, but the street was empty. Feeling more uneasy by the minute, I quickened my pace. I was only a few blocks from home. I just needed to get there and lock the door. As I reached the corner of Maple and Oak, I saw a figure standing under a flickering streetlight. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a hat that obscured his face. His presence sent a chill down my spine. I tried to ignore him and kept walking, but as I passed, he spoke in a deep, raspy voice. "Lost, are we?" I didn't reply and kept moving, my heart pounding in my chest. The man didn't follow, but I could feel his eyes on me. I turned the corner and broke into a run. When I finally reached my house, I fumbled with my keys, glancing over my shoulder to see if the man was following me. Thankfully, he wasn't there. I rushed inside, locked the door, and leaned against it, trying to calm my racing heart. I thought I was safe, but then the phone rang. I answered, my voice shaking. "Hello?" The same raspy voice from the street replied, "You can't hide from me." I dropped the phone and backed away, staring at the door. The shadows outside the window seemed to move, and I realized that I might never truly be safe from whatever was lurking on Maple Street that night.
I was driving across country with my mom and sister when I was 16 and my sister was 20. It was late, but we were well rested still and alert. We were driving along an interstate and needed gas and a bathroom break, so we stopped at the only rest stop in 200 miles. There was a van full of teenagers on a road trip at the gas station, as well as a small gray car parked at the pump in front of us, with 2 young men standing still outside of it. When we got there, everything felt wrong. We'd been on the road for days and seen many rest stops at night, and had never been afraid until then. My mom and sister went inside, and I stayed in the car. I heard the teenagers say they were creeped out and couldn't get the pump to work, and they left in a hurry. I was watching the car in front of us, and the 2 men had not moved at all. Not an inch. They weren't talking. They weren't on phones. They were just standing there, still as stone. My sister and mom came running back out to the car, and when they got in, the 2 men slowly turned to look at us while not moving or pivoting the rest of their bodies. And I swear to fucking shit, we all saw the same thing. They had eyes dark as pitch and empty, truly empty. Not black, not reflecting any light at all, just a void. We sped out of there and didn't stop until we were in the next city. The worst thing about the entire experience? We couldn't find the place on any map. We knew exactly which spot on the interstate to look, and we couldn't find it on Google Maps or any paper map we had. We even asked locals about the creepy gas station out on that stretch of road and got only confused looks. We've traveled on that interstate since, and there is no rest stop. I worked as a forensic nurse in a hospital's lockup unit. We had one older lady who swore she was being haunted and abused by a demon she would call Tiberius. So many crazy things happened while she was on the unit. We'd go into the room, do normal care, leave, and seconds later she'd start screaming bloody murder. We'd run into the room to find her looking like she'd been in a fight with a boxing champ, black eye, markings all over her body. No one ever saw her doing this stuff to herself. Things would get moved around the room by themselves. At one point she was in protective restraints because the doctor thought she was hurting herself. There was no way she could have moved or done anything to herself while in these restraints, but new marks would always appear or her tray would be across the room. The room was secure, so there was no way someone else was doing this. When we asked her questions, she'd just say, "It was Tiberius." After she was discharged, we always had trouble with that room. If there was going to be a rapid response or code, it happened in that room. One night a guard reported lights blinking on and off. It was that room. Shortly after college, I got married. We immediately moved into a basement apartment because that's all that was available within our budget. This place had a poltergeist, and my wife was terrified. Whatever resided there with us made it clear it wanted to live alone. Dishes, glasses, and other items would fly off the shelf. My wife was hit several times. There was always an ominous feeling like we were being watched. At night when we walked through the apartment in the dark, there would be insanely bright flashes of light that would illuminate the entire room. One night while we were going to bed, as soon as my wife and I walked into the bedroom, we heard a voice from nowhere say, "Mr. Johann, move." My wife looked at me. I looked at her. I said loudly, "You've got it, bud." We moved out 2 days later and stayed with family. The old lady who owned the place died a few months later, and the house was torn down. It is still an empty lot to this day, nothing but grass and a tree. I still drive by it every now and again. I worked at a small convenience store in the early 1990s. We had one of those fry dailies that served chicken, corn dogs, burritos, and other quick snacks. Most nights were quiet, especially the late shifts. I liked the peace and routine of it. One night, I had just finished cleaning the fryer. We had run out of burritos and chicken earlier in the evening, so I shut everything down about an hour before closing. The store was almost empty, and I was looking forward to closing up and going home. Just as I was about to lock the doors, a man walked in. He looked tired and a bit scruffy. He came straight to the counter and asked for some burritos. I told him, "I'm sorry, but we're out of burritos and I've already shut down the fryer for the night." He didn't say anything for a moment, just nodded and started walking around the store. I assumed he was looking for something else to buy. I watched him from the corner of my eye while I finished my closing tasks. A few minutes later, he came back to the counter. I expected him to buy a drink or some chips, but instead, he pulled out a knife. My heart skipped a beat. "Cook me some burritos," he said, his voice calm but with a dangerous edge. "Or I'm going to stab you." I felt a surge of fear, but I tried to stay calm. "I really don't have any burritos," I said, my voice shaking a little. "Look, I'll show you." I slowly walked to the freezer, making sure to keep my movements slow and non-threatening. He followed me, the knife still in his hand. I opened the freezer and showed him the empty shelves where the burritos usually were. "See? We're out of burritos. I'm sorry, but I can cook anything else you want from here. We have corn dogs, chicken nuggets, anything but burritos." He looked inside the freezer for a long moment, then turned to me. His eyes were cold and calculating. "You really are out," he said, almost to himself. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I'm really sorry." For a few seconds we just stood there, staring at each other. Then, to my immense relief, he put the knife away. He didn't say anything else, just turned and walked out of the store. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Once I was sure he was gone, I quickly locked the door and called the police. The officers arrived a few minutes later. I told them what had happened, and they took my statement. They looked around the store and checked the security footage, but the man was already long gone. They promised to patrol the area and keep an eye out for him. After they left, I finished closing up the store. My hands were still shaking as I counted the cash and turned off the lights. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to being stabbed over a burrito. The next day, I told my boss about what happened. He was shocked and promised to install better security measures, including a panic button under the counter. I was grateful, but the incident left a lasting impact on me. For weeks, I was jumpy and nervous, especially during the late shifts. Every time someone walked into the store, I felt a spike of anxiety. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting the man with the knife to come back. But he never did, and gradually I started to feel more at ease. Working the night shift at a convenience store had always felt routine and safe. But that night showed me that danger can come out of nowhere, even in the most familiar places. It's a lesson I'll never forget. I was standing in my parents' room, talking to my very sick dad at the time. He was dying of stage 4 esophageal cancer. I got the feeling something was behind me. I looked towards the doorway to the living room, and something about 4 feet 6 inches and fully black is peeking around the corner, with its hands on the door frame. I ran towards it, and it slipped back around the door. When I got outside the doorway, there was nothing. My dad was completely confused when I stepped back inside the room. When I tell him, people who stayed at my house in my dad's final days claimed to have seen it. My mom saw the figure on multiple occasions in multiple places until he passed away. We haven't seen it since. I don't know what possesses me to binge read Reddit real-life ghost stories about twice a year, when each place I live always has some kind of resident spirit. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early in my career I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he couldn't talk, but there were no medical reasons as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Duchesne, and I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess via fingerprints. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day every day, moving his mouth that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. I'm not a doctor, but I'm a nurse. I work with geriatric patients, and there was this incident about 3 years ago. Before I explain, let me say that I don't believe in ghosts. Anyway, this one time I was working the night shift and I was super sleepy, so I decided to skip lunch because I wasn't hungry and go to my car and sleep for 30 minutes. I got inside my car, covered myself with my sweater, set the timer on my phone, and immediately knocked out. I'm dreaming, but in my dream I'm still awake, just sitting there. Someone taps on my car window and I see that it's one of my patients. We'll call her Dee. Surprised, I ask Dee what the hell she's doing outside, and she tells me she is looking for her daughter. I tell her to go back inside and that we will call her daughter in the morning. My patient becomes angry and starts banging on my car window. I kind of freak out and try to reach for the door handle to get out and calm her down, but I quickly realize I can't move. Let me add that I frequently experience sleep paralysis, so even though I am asleep, I realize what is happening. I fight it and try squirming my body in an attempt to wake myself up. I finally manage to wake up, and my heart is racing and my forehead is a bit sweaty. I sit there for about a minute, realize it was all a dream, and roll the window down to cool myself off. My break is over and I clock back in and see that my supervisor and 2 other nurses are huddled in front of a room. I am still by the station clocking when they see me and call me over. I walk over thinking maybe something was wrong with the ventilator or the patient fell, but my supervisor tells me Dee died while I was on my lunch break. Since most of our patients are DNR, I was not paged. It took a couple of seconds for the message to register, and I freaked out internally. I got goosebumps but didn't mention anything to my supervisor about the dream. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, and I mostly likely had that dream because she was the last patient I interacted with before my break. So she was still on my mind, and I was mentally going over my patient's charts in my head. Was unconscious for about 2 weeks, and spent a total of almost 3 months in the hospital. I used to visit him every day from morning until night. We didn't have any insurance at the time, so he had to stay in a ward with up to 7 other patients at a time, although usually it was 3 to 4 patients. One of the patients was a man in his mid to late 60s. He was a very kind man whose bed was directly in front of my father's. One day I came back from a quick lunch break only to find my father sleeping, and there was nothing on the TV for me to watch. I was bored and sort of zoned out, staring in the general direction of the elderly patient in front of me, who happened to be getting a visit from his kids and grandchildren. As I was zoned out, I started to notice something floating above this man. I looked up and saw 3 shadowy figures floating in a circular pattern around him. They looked like 3 people wearing dark cloaks but with no hands or feet, and seemed to be diving in and out of a hole I couldn't see. One moment they would disappear into the hole, and the next they would pop right back out. I sat there stunned as I watched this, and that's when one of them broke off from the 3 and floated in my direction. It got right in my face, and I just backed my head as far back as I could in the chair I was sitting in. After that, it floated back to the other 3, and then they all went out the back wall and disappeared. I had the most sickening feeling that this man was going to die. I just knew that these things were there because he wasn't going to make it. The elderly patient had been fine the whole time I had known him, but later that night he started complaining about stomach pains. The next day he was moved to the private room next to ours. And the day after that I ran into his daughter, who was crying her eyes out. Knowing the answer, I asked her what's wrong. She said, "My father died today, he was fine. And then he just got sicker and died. We still don't know what happened." I felt so sad for her and that lovely family, but there was no point in telling her what I saw, so I kept it to myself. To this day, I'm still not 100% sure of what I saw, but it was pretty disturbing if I'm being honest. Nighttime staffing issues. I agreed to rotate to nights to help them out. It was a 4-bed, newly renovated unit. It was around 3 a.m., and I was watching the monitors, listening to the patients snore. The pencil drawer slid open. I didn't think much of it since the hospital was on a very busy avenue, and I thought it was caused by the vibrations from the traffic on the busy road below. After sliding the drawer back several times, I decided if the drawer felt it needed to be opened, so be it. Several minutes later, I heard a noise in the room. The patient's bathroom door opening, and the sound of someone pushing an IV pole. Since I did not have clear view of the bathroom, I just thought one of the staff members from the main floor had dashed in to wash their hands. I looked up from my monitor viewing to see a patient we recently had in the unit. It was Mrs. G, an older woman who came in with atypical chest pain, became septic due to a gallbladder issue. She evidently had expired in the unit. Although the hospital itself had been on this site for years, the unit was newly renovated, right down to tearing down walls and putting up new ones. I heard the patient's bathroom door open, and again I heard the rattling of the IV pole and shuffling feet. I looked up and saw Mrs. G, standing there in the middle of the floor, one hand pushing the IV pole, the other hand on top of the pump on the pole. She stopped walking, turned and waved, nodded her head, said everything was going to be okay, took a few steps and disappeared. It was quite a sight to see. Shortly after that vision, one of the nurses from the floor came in to see if I needed anything. I told her no, I was okay, and asked her if she had ever seen a ghost in the hospital. She looked at me, gasped, and asked no, why, and I explained to her what had just happened. She said she would never step foot in that room again. Mrs. G was the first patient to die in that unit. She was well liked by all the staff, and my feeling was that she was watching over us. The day shift came in, and I told them my story. They weren't surprised. Through the years working at various hospitals, worked as a nurse extern my senior year in nursing school, and heard older nurses telling their stories about ghosts, I thought they were just burnt out. Ha! Yes, there are ghosts in care facilities. If they are not seen, their presence is felt. They leave an energy behind.